From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The Charlottesville rally was supposed to be about a Confederate monument. But anyone who was paying attention could see that it was about more than a single statue. It felt like a national reckoning around race was coming. And being here would help me understand it.
A year after the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, far-right groups are converging again this weekend at another Unite the Right rally, this time in Washington, D.C. We'll speak with A.C. Thompson about his new Frontline ProPublica documentary documenting hate, Charlottesville. We'll also speak with Susan Bro, the mother of Heather Heyer, the 32-year-old anti-racist activist killed by a neo-Nazi in Charlottesville 1 year ago.
I could see that Heather's death had meaning in the world, that her death had purpose. But boy, I was not happy to be the one to have to make that sacrifice.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration's reimposed economic sanctions against Iran following Trump's decision to withdraw from the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The reimposition of sanctions increases tensions between the U.S. and Iran and the U.S. and its European allies. This morning, Trump threatened other countries seeking to trade with Iran, tweeting, "Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States," unquote. Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement even though international experts certified Iran was complying with the terms of the deal. On Monday, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani condemned the sanctions as psychological warfare and said he would not begin negotiations until the sanctions are withdrawn.
The first step would be for U.S. President Donald Trump to show that he genuinely wants to engage in negotiations to solve a problem. What's the meaning of negotiations when you impose sanctions at the same time? It's like someone pulling a knife to stab a rival or an enemy in the arm, while at the same time claiming we should be talking and negotiating. The answer in such a case would be to say, remove the knife from the arm and put the knife away.
In Brazil, the Workers' Party has nominated imprisoned former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, as the party's presidential candidate. Lula's currently in jail serving a 12-year sentence on a corruption conviction his party says was politically motivated. Polls show him as the front-running candidate for the October presidential elections, but the Supreme Electoral Court is expected to bar him from running. His imprisonment has been condemned internationally, including by 29 U.S. lawmakers who wrote, quote, "The facts of President Lula's case give us reason to believe the main objective of his jailing is to prevent him from running in upcoming elections." To see our hour with Lula, you can go to democracynow.org. Rick Gates, the right-hand man of Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, testified in federal court Monday that he's been involved in criminal activity with Manafort. Gates has accepted a plea deal to testify against Manafort, who's facing 18 charges, including tax fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. Manafort's trial is the first trial associated with special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Trump's ties to Russia. During Monday's hearing, Gates testified he helped Manafort hide secret foreign bank accounts, obscured 15 shell companies, which the prosecution alleges were part of a long-running tax and bank fraud scheme. In his testimony, Rick Gates said, quote, "I was the one who helped organize the paperwork." Voters are heading to the polls for primary races in 4 states today: Missouri, Kansas, Michigan, and Washington State. In Michigan, former Detroit Health Commissioner Abdul El-Sayed is facing off against Gretchen Whitmer for the Democratic nomination for Michigan's governor. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and New York congressional Democratic nominee Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other progressive leaders have endorsed Dr. El-Sayed, who is vying to become the nation's first Muslim governor. This is Dr. El-Sayed speaking with The Intercept's Mehdi Hassan about what he would do on his first day of office if elected.
Number one, I want to shut down Line 5. Our Great Lakes account for 20% of the world's fresh water, 85% of the water in North America. And right now, we've got an oil pipeline that's 15 years past when it was supposed to shut down, that's already had several incidents. We've got to shut down that Line 5 because we've got to protect that water. There are also issues related to water in Flint and Detroit. And in Flint, I want to set up a Flint task force that would work on, within the first year, getting all of the lead piping out of the ground so that folks can drink easily in the city of Flint. They have suffered too much, and they still don't have clean water. And then we need to put a moratorium on water shutoffs in the city of Detroit. The city alone this summer shut down about 17,000 homes from having basic access to water because they can't pay. Meanwhile, we've got Nestle bottling our fresh water for $400 a year, and folks have to pay $400 a month in Detroit. I want to put a moratorium on that as well.
Abdullah Sayed is one of a handful of Muslim-American candidates on the ballot today in Michigan. Former state legislator Rashida Tlaib and former Obama administration official Firuz Saad are also running for congressional seats. Meanwhile, in Kansas, a crowded congressional race pits progressive labor lawyer Brent Welder against Sharice Davids, a Native American lawyer and former mixed martial arts fighter. And in Ohio, Republicans are scrambling to avoid an embarrassing defeat in a special congressional election in a district Republicans have held for decades. Republican Troy Balderson is facing Democrat Danny O'Connor. Both Democrats and Republicans have poured millions into the race to replace Ohio Republican Congressmember Pat Tiberi. In more election news, Democrats in Tennessee are celebrating a blue wave that swept through Shelby County last week as Democrats won 21 of the 26 county offices up for grabs. The blue wave reinstalls Democrats to power after Republicans seized control in 2010. Among the winners was Democrat Lee Ardrey Harris, who was elected mayor of Shelby County. In Bangladesh, massive student protests have brought the capital Dhaka to a standstill as students demand safer roads. The protests began after a speeding private bus ran over a group of students, killing 2 teenagers on July 29th. Since then, massive youth-led demonstrations have swept Bangladesh, which has one of the highest rates of road accidents in the world. The Bangladeshi government's responded by violently cracking down on the student protesters and arresting journalists reporting on the protests. This is one of the protesting students, Nasmul Hussain.
We've been protesting on the roads for a few days with some of our demands. We're demanding justice for those students at the Ramiz Udin Cantonment College killed by a bus, and we want safe roads.
Diplomatic tensions are rising between Saudi Arabia and Canada after Canada accused the Saudi government of human rights violations and demanded the release of feminist activists imprisoned in the kingdom. In response, Saudi Arabia has expelled the Canadian ambassador, frozen trade with Canada, and suspended direct flights to Toronto. Since May 15th, Saudi Arabia has arrested at least 15 high-profile human rights and women's rights activists. Back in the United States and California, the raging Mendocino complex fire is now the largest wildfire ever recorded in California's history. The fire has already scorched more than 250,000 square acres. It's one of more than a dozen fires burning statewide. Apple, Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify have removed Alex Jones and his InfoWars website from their platforms. Apple removed 5 of Jones' 6 podcasts, saying Apple does not tolerate hate speech. Facebook said it removed Jones' pages because he was, quote, glorifying violence and using dehumanizing language to describe people who are transgender, Muslims, and immigrants. Alex Jones regularly spreads far-right-wing conspiracy theories. He's being sued by the parents of the elementary school children killed in the 2012 Sandy Hook school massacre for claiming the massacre was a hoax staged by gun control advocates. The for-profit prison company GEO Group has threatened to sue the human rights group The Dream Defenders, which is planning a national day of action today to protest the private prison company. GEO Group is Immigration and Customs Enforcement's single biggest contractor, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars to run private immigrant prisons. The Dream Defenders are planning to disrupt GEO Group operations in cities across the United States today, including in Florida, Arizona, California, and New York City. In Wisconsin, a masked gunman opened fire on a Madison community radio station early Sunday morning, injuring 1 person. A station DJ who was shot in the buttocks was taken to the hospital and later discharged. WORT-FM resumed normal programming Sunday morning, just hours after the attack on their studio. No arrests have been made. WORT-FM is a member-controlled community radio station broadcasting to south-central Wisconsin that's been on the air since 1975. The Madison police say they do not believe the attack was motivated by hatred of the media. And in New York, former Black Panther Robert Seth Hayes has been released from prison after 45 years behind bars. He was convicted of the 1973 killing of a New York City transit officer. He's been eligible for parole since 1998, but had been denied parole 10 times before finally being set free. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This week marks 1 year since white supremacists and neo-Nazis descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, in the deadly Unite the Right rally to protest Charlottesville's decision to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a downtown park. It became the biggest and deadliest white supremacist rally in the United States in decades. The violence began on the night of August 11th, when hundreds of white men bearing torches marched on the University of Virginia campus and attacked a small group of anti-racist protesters. Then, on the morning of August 12th, up to 1,000 white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville. Many were carrying Nazi flags, other white supremacist paraphernalia as well. Some wore body armor and carried assault rifles and pistols. They were met by thousands of anti-racist counter-demonstrators. Police did little to intervene, even as the violent street fights broke out. That afternoon, a white supremacist named James Alex Fields drove his Dodge Charger into a crowd of counter-demonstrators, killing an anti-racist activist named Heather Heyer. 19 other people were injured. Fields has since been charged with first-degree murder as well as federal hate crimes. Well, this weekend, white supremacists are planning to mark the first anniversary of Charlottesville by holding another Unite the Right rally, this time in Washington, D.C. Anti-fascist and anti-racist protesters are preparing to stage a counter-protest. Today, we look back at the deadly rally in Charlottesville, the subject of a new documentary by Frontline PBS and ProPublica titled Documenting Hate Charlottesville. In a few minutes, we'll be joined by reporter A.C. Thompson, but first an excerpt of his new investigation.
I arrived in Charlottesville for what would become the largest gathering of white supremacists in a generation. They called it Unite the Right, and it was drawing groups from at least 35 states.
Good afternoon. I'm Chief Thomas, Charlottesville Police Department. We will have a significant police presence throughout the weekend. Well over 100 officers from my agency, several hundred officers from the Virginia State Police. We were informed that the National Guard is monitoring this situation.
The day before the rally, a few reporters gathered for the police press conference. But I'd begun to hear from other sources in Charlottesville.
We have time for one more question.
Chief, we're hearing rumors of there being another Torchlight March tonight, an unpermitted march. Do you have any information about that?
I've heard the same rumors, but I don't have a lot of details. What have you heard? Where is that going to be taking place? In the city or the county?
5 or 6 o'clock.
Where at?
Not far from here is what we've been hearing.
The police had heard the same rumors I had, but the university grounds were quiet, and it seemed like the march might not be happening after all. Until suddenly, the torches appeared.
You will not replace us! 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 You will not replace us!
In a matter of moments, hundreds of neo-Nazis and white supremacists assembled and marched on the university. The police arrived on the scene, but watched from the sidelines as a small group of anti-racist activists were quickly surrounded. One of them, Emily Gorsensky, was streaming it from her phone.
We are pinned in. We are surrounded on all sides. by hundreds of Nazis. We have no way out.
Where are your friends at? Where are your friends at? We outnumber you. We outnumber you. We want this. White lives matter. White lives matter. White lives matter. White lives matter.
I got punched. I got kicked. I remember getting hit in the head. I thought it was with a torch. I stepped forward at one point, and I got shoved back. I thought I was going to die. The thing that I was thinking as the melee was happening was, I just need to keep the camera going, you know? That was the only thing that I could do. Yeah, it was like 100 people beating up, like a small group of us. And a small group of students.
people.
Yeah. You could feel how angry they were, but also how happy they were, you know, to be doing this, to be intimidating people like this.
Had you ever seen that displayed before?
No, never in my life. They were cheering, they were running through the streets, yelling at people, and they walked away and they got away with it. They're coming in here the next day ready to do more. I thought, like, here we go. Yeah, here we go.
The documentary documenting hate, Charlottesville, will be played tonight across the country. This is another excerpt.
Charlottesville, Virginia, August 12, 2017. I've been tracking hate crimes since the 2016 presidential election, and I could see that something was happening in this country. The Charlottesville rally was supposed to be about a Confederate monument, but anyone who was paying attention could see that it was about more than a single statue. It felt like a national reckoning around race was coming. And being here would help me understand it. I came here to ask questions. But as the day unraveled into chaos around me, one thing became clear. This was not a place to listen or understand. Charlottesville was a crime scene.
An excerpt from A.C. Thompson's Frontline ProPublica documentary documenting hate, Charlottesville, which is premiering tonight on PBS stations around the country. A.C. Thompson joining us here in New York. Welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me on.
What a critical documentary this is, as the Unite the Right rally is planned again for Washington, D.C. this weekend. Talk about this journey you took, starting in Charlottesville. You were there on that day a year ago, on those days, August 11th and 12th.
You know, we went down there and we went to the events, myself and my colleagues, because I had seen this resurgence of white power, white supremacist activity that I hadn't seen in decades. I had reported on these people in the 90s, and they had sort of faded away. And then in the last 2 years, they had really come back with a vengeance. There were all these new groups, all these new activists, all these new leaders, and they sort of seemed to be piggybacking on the Trump moment and trying to build their movement again. We went down there. We were expecting it to be possibly bloody, possibly violent, but we did not expect it to be what it turned out to be, which was lethal.
So we see you in the documentary questioning the police chief the day before. As you said, you were among a handful of reporters who were at this police news conference announcing what the plans were. And you asked this last question. Explain what it was that you asked and what information you had.
You know, I wanted to know if they were going to do anything about the torch march that we were hearing would happen that night on the campus of the University of Virginia. And the chief was kind of coy and didn't really say much about it. And it turned out that really nobody was ready for that. The university police weren't ready for that. The local police, the Charlottesville and county sheriffs, were not ready for that. And it turned into basically a bloodbath. When you go back and you look at the video in our film, what you see are white supremacists attacking mostly anti-racist student group over and over again with flaming torches and hitting them in the heads with them. Police were late to the scene and basically intervened very, very late.
I mean, you say to the police chief, you've talked about plans for tomorrow, but what about tonight, you say?
And
that was the tiki torch holding. And I hate to say tiki torch because it sort of minimizes it. Yes, it ridicules them, but it also takes away the violence of what happened.
Right. And later what would happen with both that night and the next day is the city commissioned an exhaustive investigative report about police failures. And it said, look, the UVA, the university police, they didn't really understand what they were dealing with. They thought this was just going to be a typical protest march, not a volatile, violent situation. And they were out of place and unprepared. The next day, more of the same.
Before we get to the next day, Democracy Now! Spoke with Cornel West last year, the Harvard, Princeton University theological professor, who was in Charlottesville that weekend for the counter demonstrations with members of clergy, students, Black Lives Matter activists, protesters with the anti-fascist movement known as Antifa. And I asked him about the reports that the counter-protesters were attacked with torches, pepper spray, and lighter fluid.
Absolutely. You had a number of the courageous students of all colors at the University of Virginia who were protesting against the neo-fascists themselves. The neo-fascists had their own ammunition, and this is very important to keep in mind because the police, for the most part, pulled back. The next day, for example, although the 20 of us who were standing, many of them clergy, we would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists who approached over 350 anti-fascists. We just had 20, and we singing This Little Light of Mine. You know what I mean? So that
Antifa meaning anti-fascists.
The anti-fascists, and the crucial role of the anarchists, because they saved our lives, actually. We would have been completely crushed, and I'll never forget that.
Talking about the events of August 11th and 12th in Charlottesville. And you have in your documentary the image of Cornel West and other religious leaders arm in arm just walking.
Yeah, we followed them from the sunrise ceremony they had at a nearby church to the park where the main Unite the Right rally occurred. And I think, to me, one of the images that I have early on that morning being with that group of clergy is I remember there was a white man wearing a Nazi swastika T-shirt, and within the first 5 minutes of being there, he was shoving around an African-American photographer. And that sort of was the tone for the day, that it was going to be violent, it was going to be aggressive, and really nobody was going to stop the violence.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion with A.C. Thompson, correspondent for Frontline PBS, a reporter with ProPublica. His investigation documenting Hate Charlottesville premieres tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern on PBS stations and online at pbs.org/frontline. We'll continue what he did next, going to Charlottesville across the country to track the Unite the Right activists who it seemed like the federal government was not exactly investigating. And we'll begin with what President Trump had to say after that rally. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
There's a great and a bloody fight around this whole world tonight. In the battle of bombs and shrapnel rain, Hitler told the world around he would tear our union down. But our union's gonna break them slavery chains. Our union's gonna break them slavery chains. I walked up on a mountain in the middle of the sky. Could see every farm and every town. I could see all the people in this whole wide world. That's a union that'll tear the fascists down, down, down. That's a union that'll tear the fascists down. When I think of the men and the ships going down while the Russians fight on across the Don, there's London in ruins and Paris in chains. Good people, what are we waiting on? Good people, what are we waiting on? So I thank the Soviets and the mighty Chinese vets.
Tear the Fascists Down by Woody Guthrie here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Soon we'll be speaking with Heather Heyer's mother, Susan Bro, who'll be joining us from Charlottesville. But right now I want to turn back to President Trump last August. Speaking at the news conference he held in the lobby of Trump Tower, his residence here in New York, defending his decision to wait 2 full days before placing blame on white supremacists for the deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. During the news conference, the president attacked the anti-racist counter-protesters, repeating his earlier claim there was violence on all sides.
There was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as neo, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
So that was President Trump. A.C. Thompson, talk about his response and the effect you believe it had.
You know, for members of the white power movement, this was a sort of opening. They said, hey, the president is basically lending us some support. He's not totally condemning us. He's saying some of us are fine people. And the folks that I talked to in that movement took heart in that. They felt inspired and excited about that. And they thought, you know, this guy is on our side.
So you decide in Charlottesville, you're trying to figure out who the people are who are carrying the torches. Who are the people hitting, beating, going after those bystanders, also a smaller group of protesters who were directly confronting them, and the thousands that were also there?
Right. You know, what we saw there was a police failure on the day, but we also saw what seemed to be a sort of ongoing, slow-moving law enforcement failure to bring the people who'd been involved in these incredibly vicious altercations to justice and hold them accountable. And what we wanted to do was go figure out who were these people, what had they done, and sort of why had they eluded the authorities, what had happened in the intervening months. And so we set out to sort of identify these characters and identify specific crimes that we could sort of tell people, hey, look, this is something that happened and nobody has been held accountable.
So were you just tracking the FBI, tracking the police, tracking these people?
No, we were doing our own investigation. We were, you know, basically trying to figure this out all on our own. And for me, I was immediately drawn to a group called the Rise Above movement. And they're based in Southern California. I live in California. And they had been involved in violent protests up and down my state. And when I realized, oh, these guys were in Charlottesville too, I thought this is a group that I need to focus on because they are a white power street fighting crew. They are capable of significant violence in sort of ways that some of these other actors aren't. They're trained fighters. And I had seen them involved in these really, really nasty attacks on both coasts.
That's Rise Above movement.
That's the Rise Above movement.
RAM. So talk about Rob Rundo.
So Rob Rundo is the founder of the group. He's a young man who grew up here in New York City. He was in Flushing, Queens. At the time when he was growing up, he ran like a small multiracial gang. They had an altercation with MS-13, the Salvadoran gang. Rundo ended up stabbing a member of that gang multiple times. He went to prison.
You show that on video.
It's on video. Yeah, we have the surveillance video. And he went to prison in upstate New York. And by the time he got out of prison, he was definitely a committed white supremacist. He ends up moving to California, and he starts up a new gang, the Rise Above movement. And this is a political white supremacist gang.
And so talk about Charlottesville and Rob Rundo's presence there.
So he wasn't there, but his people were there. And they were involved in multiple skirmishes that we saw. So one of them was a guy named Mike Masellis. And Mike Masellis, we have documentary evidence of him hurling a full Coke can at counter-protesters. We believe he threw a rock at counter-protesters. He came with his hands taped up like a boxer, as if he was preparing for a fight. He was wearing a mouth guard like a boxer would wear. And we have video of him engaging in this altercation with counter-protesters, where he pushes a couple to the ground and starts punching them when they're on the ground. His colleague, Ben Daly, enters into the fray and chokes and attacks 2 female counter-protesters, leaving them bloody. So this was a pretty nasty fight that we saw that seemed totally unnecessary and that we captured on video. Our goal was, when we first started doing this work, we didn't know these guys' names. We didn't know what they had done. We were trying to identify them, and we said we want to know who these guys in this video are.
So on July 5th, you reported a story about Michael Masalas for ProPublica, headlined, "He is a member of a violent white supremacist group. So why is he working for a defense contractor with a security clearance?" One day after your story was published, Michael Masalas lost his job. Talk about how you tracked him down.
So we had these photos and videos, and we had seen him at these rallies, but we didn't know his name. We didn't know who he was. Eventually, over many months, we were able to get a break that gave us his name, and we were able to corroborate that, yeah, this is the guy.
Talk about that break.
We had a law enforcement source who said, hey, this is evidence that's going to lead you to this guy, and helped us lead us to that name. We went and saw Michael Masalas, and it's in our film, and said, hey.
And you confront him when he's getting in his car, where?
This is in Southern California, not far from the Northrop Grumman plant. And you can watch the video and decide what you think about it, but I was struck by the fact that he seemed kind of highly unsurprised to have somebody come and say, hey, what were you doing in Charlottesville last summer? To me, he didn't seem particularly shocked by that.
He immediately said, of course, I wasn't there, but you kept pushing.
Right. He said I wasn't there, and he denied being there at the time. He has since, or his group has since, gone back on that and acknowledged that he was there.
And talk about Northrop Grumman.
So Northrop Grumman at first said nothing. We kept asking them, hey, what's the story with this guy? How did he get a security clearance? What is he doing working for your company? And they said nothing to us. We made repeated queries to them about this. Then, when we published our story, they issued a statement saying, hey, we don't approve of this. We're investigating. We're concerned about this. The CEO of the company at the time sent out a bulletin to everybody on the staff, an internal bulletin saying it's not good. We're not down with this. And eventually, we were alerted that he had been let go from the company.
And when was that?
The day after, about 24 hours afterwards.
And what other images did you have? Did you have images of him at other locations?
We had video of him in Berkeley, and we had video of him in Charlottesville, both times in these violent altercations, and really looking like he was prepared for violence. So hands taped up, goggles, mouthpiece in, that kind of thing.
And when you talk about these protests in California, for those who are not familiar with them, no Charlottesville, because, well, a person died there, right. Heather Heyer, and again, in a few minutes, we'll be talking with her mother. But you had seen this coming talk about the series of Unite the Right rallies that were held throughout California.
Yeah, so there was, in 2016 and 2017, there was a whole string of far-right and racist rallies that occurred throughout California, and almost every one of these turned into a bloodbath. So you had a Klan rally in the spring of 2016 in Anaheim. 3 people were stabbed. You had a Nazi rally in Sacramento. In 2016, the summer, 7 people were stabbed. And then you had conflicts in Huntington Beach, a Trump march, where the Rise Above movement first made its presence known, and there were numerous altercations. A journalist from the OC Weekly newspaper was attacked there by the Rise Above movement. And then you had Berkeley, and the Berkeley battles, the Berkeley demonstrations were incredibly violent, sort of street fighting, political warfare in the streets events that went on through the spring. That Rise Above movement was present, Nazi groups were present, other white supremacist groups, and also sort of less extreme pro-Trump groups were there. But these were really highly violent scenarios that were poorly policed, where they got out of control and just spun on for hours.
You know, earlier I asked you if you were tracking the FBI, tracking them. But, I mean, I think what clearly comes through in your documentary is your sort of utter surprise that you felt like you were out there on your own tracking these people.
Right, exactly. Like that was our sense from much of the work that we were doing, was that there was not a lot of interest from law enforcement in these characters. I believe that has possibly changed now, but while we were doing our work, it wasn't like there was an investigative trail left by law enforcement for us to follow.
I want to ask you about the U.S. Marine Corps Lance Corporal, who you identify as a neo-Nazi and assailant during last August's bloody white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia.
So that's Vasilius Pistolis. And Pistolis is, I would say, a fascinating and disturbing character. He, at the time of the Charlottesville rally, he was a member of what I would say is the most extreme, most dangerous white supremacist group, and that's the Atomwaffen Division, which is a group of committed domestic Nazi terrorists whose goal is to start a race war, overthrow the U.S. government, and establish a fascist state. And they aim to do that through guerrilla warfare, assassination, and political terrorism. So at the same time Pistolis is serving in the Marine Corps, he is in a group that is dedicated to overthrowing the government through force of arms.
Now, Atomwaffen, Atomwaffen.
Right. So that means, in German, that means nuclear weapons, and then with the English word division. So it's sort of a nod to the Third Reich.
And talk about the encrypted chats that they have online. Talk about Discord.
Right. So working with my colleagues Jake Hanrahan and Ali Winston, we were able to get access to 250,000 chat messages sent privately by the group. And they sort of really lay out the group's ideology, their intentions, and sort of their menace. You know, some of the chat messages that we got included people talking about specific plans to blow up the power grid in Western states. They talked about plans to manufacture weapons. They talked about training camps that they were doing in the Nevada desert, in the Midwest, training people in hand-to-hand combat and guerrilla warfare.
You took your information back to Emily Gorsinski.
Right.
In Charlottesville, and explain what you found and what she had been looking for as well.
Right. So Emily and I had been messaging one another since shortly after the Charlottesville events, and she was trying to figure out, hey, who attacked me on the night of the 11th? And we had some notion that perhaps it was the Rise Above movement. We knew that they were there and they were close to her. Maybe it was somebody else. And eventually I come across in these chat logs Vasilius Pistolis talking quite explicitly about attacking Emily as well as attacking many other people. He said,
wait, this is really important. He didn't just say, I attacked this person. He talked about her, Emily Gorsinski.
Right. That was what was stunning to me. That was what, like, you never see that, right? It's like somebody has just offered you up the evidence right there. And I think it's because Emily had been live streaming that. And so people started, on the far right, started knowing her name. And then he wanted to take credit for that assault. And from everything we can tell, we know he was there. We have video of him entering that fray. Emily's not entirely sure if the kick that he launched actually hit her, but she knows, and we can see from the video, that he propelled himself into that melee and that basically the violence escalated from the time that he jumped in. He also, later said, we have video of him beating somebody with a wooden flagpole the next day. And he posted these messages saying, hey, I split 3 skulls today with virtually no damage to myself. I had so much fun at Unite the Right. So he was a guy who was bragging about the violence he engaged in. He posted photos of himself in these private chats attacking people.
So talk about how you tracked him to his employer.
So that's one of the fascinating things about these chat logs from the Atomwaffen Division is you start looking at them and you realize, oh, there are several people who are active duty or former military in this group, people that have good combat training, people that know their way around weapons. And we thought, let's finally go, when we had enough evidence, go to the Marine Corps and say, hey, look, this is what we know about this guy who works for you.
And where does he work for them?
At that time, he was a Lance Corporal at Camp Lejeune down in North Carolina, which is a place that's actually had sort of persistent problems with white supremacists over the years.
This Adam Waffen leader.
Yeah, he's down there. He's on base working with the Marine Corps down there. He was a water purification specialist at that time. And we said, look, here's photos, here's video, here's what we're going to say. We need to know if you guys have taken action against this guy at all. Do you know about him? And what should we know about him? And put that out to them.
And what did they say?
What we found out was that there had already been an investigation into Pistolas by military investigators. And apparently the investigation stalled or was dropped or didn't go somewhere. But there had been an investigation for at least 6 months into his conduct. In the military, you cannot be a member of an active white supremacist group. That is against military regulations in all branches of the service. You also, engaging in criminal activity like assaulting people is also barred. But for some reason, the Marine Corps had not acted on the information that it had since before we talked to them, 6 months before they were tipped off about this. And they had allowed him to remain in the Corps.
So you have all the evidence. You have the video. You have him beating Emily Gorsinski and others.
Right. And at that point, it seems like they took more aggressive action. So they ended up court-martialing Vasilius Pistolas, and they recently separated him from the service, which is jargon to say that they had ousted him from the service. But I would point out that the court-martial that they did with Pistolas was basically a misdemeanor court-martial. And it just said, hey, you weren't following orders, you were misleading your superiors, and gave him 30 days in the brig. And then the discharge that they went through with him, I would say, from what I can tell, is not a particularly severe sort of discharge, because those things are graded, and other than honorable, a dishonorable discharge, these are serious. And I'm not sure that was the kind of thing that he got.
Because it just happened.
It just happened. And like I said, this was basically a misdemeanor court-martial that he got.
And you tracked him down. You actually talked to him in the documentary.
I actually talked to him. I emailed him first at his email, which included the numbers 88, which is a code for Heil Hitler among white supremacists. And he gave me a bunch of different stories. He said, look, I have alt-right beliefs. He suggested, yes, I am a white supremacist.
He had denied he was in Charlottesville.
But he denied he was in Charlottesville at first. And then I said, look, I've got videos of you. I've got photos of you. I've got chat logs where you're talking about this stuff. It sure looks like you. I don't know, you don't have a body double that I know of, so explain this to me. And he just basically said, hey, how about you don't publish this, and somewhere down the road I'll give you information about other white power figures, and that'll help your career, because you probably don't want to work at ProPublica for the rest of your life. And I said, no, thanks. I think we should do this story.
We're going to break, and AC, when I asked you to stay with us, but when we come back, we'll also be joined by Susan Breaux, the mother of Heather Heyer, the 32-year-old anti-racist activist who was run down by a white supremacist a year ago and killed. A.C. Thompson is correspondent for the Frontline PBS documentary and reporter for ProPublica. His investigation documenting Hate Charlottesville will premiere tonight around the country. Stay with us.
People, 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 please love. People, 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 please love. I miss your face, I miss your smile, your warm embrace, your warm embrace. The love you shared and the lives you saved might have never, ever crossed their minds. 'Cause in came hate. People, people, so short, the loss will hurt eternally.
Heather's Song by Tracy Eagle here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look back at last year's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. At the rally, a neo-Nazi named James Alex Fields drove his Dodge Charger into a crowd of counter-demonstrators, killing 32-year-old anti-racist activist Heather Heyer. 19 other people were injured. Fields has since been charged with first-degree murder as well as federal hate crimes. We're now joined by Heather's mother, Susan Breaux. She joins us from Charlottesville and joins A.C. Thompson as well, who did the documentary premiering tonight on PBS Frontline. Susan, it's a year later, but it's my first time to offer you my condolences, the whole family at Democracy Now!'s condolences on the death of your daughter, Heather.
Thank you so much.
So it has been a year since August 12th, when you lost your daughter. Talk about why Heather was out there on August 12th last year, one of those who were protesting the white supremacist rally.
Heather always believed and acted on her beliefs that equality was for all people, that if anybody is marginalized in the human race, then we all are. So when her friends who were African American were going to be at the rally, they said, come with us. And at first she was like, nah, I think I'll stay away. And then she saw where her friend Courtney had live streamed the events of Friday night. And she said, I have to go. And her friend tried to talk her out of it. And she said, I know it's dangerous. I could die, but I have to be there. And of course, when we say things like that, we don't really think we're going to die, but she was there to support her friends. And the group that she was with deliberately stayed away from the fighting all day. Wherever they saw fights, they turned away. And she was with a very large group of counter-protesters. She personally didn't even carry any signs. She just had her cigarettes, her lighter, her keys, and her phone with her. She had parked her car nearby. And she was dressed to go to work as a waitress later. She had her hair back in a long braid, and she had on her black shirt and black top that she would wear to waitress. And she thought it was going to be just a day of walking the streets, shouting Black Lives Matter and whose streets, our streets. And they had done that all day long. From what I understand from Marcus and Marissa, her friends, they thought the Nazis were all leaving. Everybody was kind of relaxed and happy as they were coming back onto the barricaded mall, and they were going to get some food and some water. It was a really hot day, and that's when Mr. Fields chose to drive his car into the crowd.
And he hit your daughter.
Yes, he did.
And injured
hit a lot
her
of other
friends.
people. Yes.
I just recently saw pictures of the wedding you were at of her dear friends, made famous because her friend, his feet up in the air as he was just upended by this car.
His leg was shattered.
As he was pushing his partner away from the car, trying to save her life.
Right. He told me he reached for Heather. He couldn't get to her, but he at least knocked Marissa out of the way. And I said, honey, it's okay. And he still cries about that to this day. He's so frustrated and angry about that. It is what it is, and we move forward. You know, I can't be consumed by grief to where I can't function. I have to move forward. So my life now revolves around, not only have I picked up Heather's baton and I'm running with it, but I'm also passing it off to as many people as I possibly can. They tried to silence my daughter. One voice. You don't get to do that. I said at her funeral, you just magnified her, because not only am I going to speak up and speak louder, but I'm going to make sure lots of other people speak up too.
Susan, did you think of Heather as an activist?
She was a quiet activist. She was very passionate about her beliefs, but she was only passionate in small groups and one-on-one conversations and in small family groups or on Facebook. That was her method of changing people's hearts and minds. And what she would do was what she was actually taped doing that day. She walked up to one of the girls as the neo-Nazis were leaving, a girl in a black helmet, and she said, "Talk to me about why you're here. Why do you feel this way? What made you want to come? Why do you hate people? Can you talk to me about it? Can you explain to me?" And, tried to be gently pulling the girl out of her belief system to talk to her. All the girl would say to her was, "No comment, no comment," because that's what they're trained to do. But that was Heather's method of converting people, was talking one-on-one.
Heather's last message on Facebook: if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Heather also worked to help people going into bankruptcy. Is that right, Susan?
Yes. One press article mistakenly put that she did that to help the poor, and somebody told me they got that from the website. We'll get that changed. Not only poor people file for bankruptcy. Donald Trump has filed for bankruptcy many times. I don't think he actually came to Heather for help, but a lot of people file for bankruptcy. But she was the bankruptcy intake person. She handled every single file that came through the office. And after she died, thousands of people over the course of the last year have come to me and said, "Well, I knew Heather." And I say, "How did you know her?" And sometimes they'll say they knew her as a bartender or a waitress, but sometimes, more often than not, they'll say they met her at Miller Law Group and that she was a person who made them feel comfortable, at ease. Many times she would help people figure out how they didn't have to even file for bankruptcy, so they never actually became a client, because Heather could help them figure out what they needed to do to save their car or save their house and get themselves back on track. So I was very proud of that as a mother, but I never knew any of that until after she was gone.
I wanted to turn to an interview that A.C. Thompson did with Democrat Mike Signer, the former mayor of Charlottesville, for the documentary documenting Hate Charlottesville.
Groups that previously had been stuck in the shadows and at the margins and at the extremes were brought into the mainstream, and that's why they felt welcome to try and unite the right in Charlottesville. At the end of the day, it's a city of, just under 50,000 people, and we were this target for forces much bigger than us.
I saw you that night over at the county government headquarters, and you looked stricken.
Stricken is not a bad word for it. I wish that we had known more. I wish that we had been given more information by the state intelligence apparatus.
Did they say anything like, "Hey, these guys are going to come with clubs, they're going to come with pepper spray, they're going to come with, implements of violence"?
No. We had one briefing with 3 members of the Virginia State Police who came and talked to us on city council. They did not present us with any evidence of a credible threat.
As I understand it, about 10 people altogether have been prosecuted from those days. Does that sound accurate to you?
It sounds like it should be a lot higher.
So that's Mike Signer, the former mayor of Charlottesville. Since then, Nikia Walker has been elected, the first African-American woman mayor of Charlottesville. The Unite the Right rally certainly might have helped her in her bid as she challenged the establishment. Her theme was unmasking the illusion. But I wanted to bring this into the conversation with you, Susan, and AC. AC, starting with you, do you think the response of Donald Trump before and after how the Trump administration is dealing with white supremacy left the Charlottesville establishment flat-footed before?
What do you mean?
Meaning that they weren't prepared and that they didn't feel they were properly briefed, that they didn't understand who these people were?
So it's a really interesting thing, because our understanding is that the federal intelligence agencies and the federal law enforcement agencies compiled research on these groups and that they had intelligence on these groups. And now our sort of question is, why did that not reach the local authorities? Why did that not reach the city council? And what happened between the federal government compiling research, the State Police Fusion Center and the State Police compiling research and intelligence, and the local police compiling intelligence that leads to somehow folks thinking that nothing bad is going to happen that day?
Susan Breaux, who do you hold responsible, in addition to James Alex Field, who has been charged with first-degree murder for the death of Heather?
Oh, well, it's a very complex issue. A lot of mistrust in all the wrong places. My understanding is that local efforts of investigation were focused on the local activists, the local anti-racist activists, and not on outside forces coming in or even the inside forces who were already here in place. Jason Kessler is one of Charlottesville's own. He also graduated from UVA. So
one of the organizers of the rally, and Richard Spencer.
Right. And my understanding is that Southern Poverty Law Center had issued warnings, but they were not being heeded. I think that many people thought, as I did, that basically the alt-not-right and the not-so-new Nazis are basically buffoons and idiots, and didn't really take them seriously. From what I have seen and observed since then, is that they generally will try to present themselves as so outrageous that nobody will take them seriously. They will come with a serious intent, but they generally will attack if they're going to most likely try a lethal attack as people are relaxing, when people are letting down their guard, saying, oh, they're leaving, oh, they're going now. I know in Florida, they actually had members get into an altercation where they were firing a gun at people at a bus stop as rally participants from both sides were leaving. It seems to be a pattern. This is what they did in Charlottesville as well.
Is it a question, AC, of poor policing or perhaps protecting white supremacists? For example, what happened last weekend in Berkeley, California. The police arrested the anti-fascist protesters, not the white supremacists, posted their names, their photos online. They haven't even been convicted.
No, I don't think it was that sort of thing where the police were protecting one side or the other. I think the police essentially
in Charlottesville.
I think the police in Charlottesville essentially abdicated their responsibility almost entirely.
You were going up to them saying, what are you doing?
Right. Because, look, we have had 50 years of, I would say, violent resistance against the Klan, against Nazis, against all these white supremacist groups. They come to the streets and they will meet heavy resistance. You know that. And so if you're law enforcement, you know the thing that I need to do is keep these two groups separated and make sure that people don't bring clubs, weapons, other sort of things that they're going to attack each other with. It's not that hard.
We just have 30 seconds. Susan Breaux, what do you want us to remember about Heather as we move into this next weekend, the anniversary of her death, another Unite the Right rally, this time in Washington, D.C.?
What I want you to remember is that everyone needs to stand up against hate. Everyone needs to pick up that baton. If you need information on how to do that, contact me at the Heather Heyer Foundation, and I will help you find ways to do that.
Susan Breaux, mother of Heather Heyer. She now runs the Heather Heyer Foundation. And A.C. Thompson, correspondent for Frontline PBS, reporter for ProPublica. His investigation documenting Hate Charlottesville, the documentary, premieres tonight on PBS stations around the country. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Has a job opening for a broadcast engineer. Check the website, democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke and